Ray Prescott heard the truck before he saw it. A deep, unhealthy rattle. The kind of sound an engine makes when it has given up arguing with its owner and simply continues out of spite. A mechanical cough followed by a wheeze followed by something that sounded like a coffee can full of ball bearings being shaken by a man with no patience. He looked up from the parts catalog on his desk through the wide glass windows of Prescott's John Deere and watched a 1976 Ford F-150 crawl into the parking lot like a wounded animal dragging itself to water. Rust had eaten through both fenders. Not surface rust, not the kind you sand off and touch up on a Saturday afternoon with a wire brush and a rattle can from the hardware store. Deep structural rust, the kind that turns steel into lace and makes a mechanic wince and look away the way a doctor looks away from an x-ray that shows something beyond repair. The kind of rust that speaks to years of a different kind of attention, the kind where a person decides that the body of a truck is cosmetic and the engine is what matters, and cosmetics are a waste of money that could be spent on something real. The passenger door was a different shade of blue than the rest of the body, clearly salvaged from another truck entirely. The fit was imperfect. A quarter-inch gap at the top let rain in and heat out, and a strip of gray weather stripping had been glued along the edge in a valiant but doomed attempt to bridge the difference. The tailgate was held shut with baling wire twisted into a knot that suggested permanence, as if whoever had rigged it had long ago abandoned any pretense that a proper latch would ever be installed. The muffler hung at an angle that suggested it would part company with the exhaust pipe before the week was out. 218,000 miles on the odometer, though the odometer itself had stopped working somewhere around 190, so the real number was anyone's guess. The windshield had a crack running diagonally from the lower left corner to the upper right, the kind of crack that starts as a chip from a gravel truck and grows an inch every winter when the frost gets into it and pries it open like a secret. The truck rolled to a stop in the far corner of the lot, as far from the gleaming new equipment as possible, as if it knew its place, as if it understood the hierarchy of machines and had accepted its position at the bottom without complaint, the way old things accept their obsolescence when the world has moved on and nobody has bothered to tell them they are finished. Tuesday morning, April 7th, 1987. The temperature was 48 degrees. A cold front had stalled over central Iowa, holding the sky at the particular shade of gray that makes April feel like November's younger brother. The kind of sky that sits on your shoulders and presses down and makes everything beneath it look flat and tired and waiting for something to change. The corn had not been planted yet. Too wet. 3 straight days of rain the previous week had left the fields saturated. The soil was black and heavy and holding water like a sponge, and every farmer in Story County was standing at his kitchen window, looking at it and doing the same calculation every day of delayed planting cost bushels at harvest, and every bushel cost dollars at the elevator, and the dollars were already tight before the rain came and made them tighter. You could feel the tension in town, at the feed mill, at the diner, at the implement shop, at the parts counter of every dealership in the county, where men stood around drinking bad coffee and watching the sky the way prisoners watch a clock. Ray owned the dealership in Ames, Iowa, had owned it 12 years, built it from a struggling 2-man operation into the top-selling John Deere franchise in Story County. 42 new tractors sold the previous year. Gross revenue north of $1.2 million. A plaque on his office wall from Deere & Company recognizing outstanding sales achievement 3 years running. The plaque was brass mounted on walnut, and Ray had positioned it so that customers could see it from the parts counter without having to walk into his office. It said what he wanted it to say without him having to say it himself. This is a man who succeeds. This is a man who knows his business. This is a man you can trust because success is its own credential. He was 47 years old, trim, sharp-eyed, with the kind of gaze that inventoried everything in a room within 3 seconds of entering it, filing away details the way a card counter files away hands. Wore pressed khakis and a green polo shirt with the John Deere logo stitched on the chest. His handshake was firm and practiced, calibrated over 2 decades of customer contact to convey exactly the right amount of confidence without crossing into aggression. His smile came easily and stayed as long as it needed to. He drove a 1985 Buick Riviera dark blue, always washed, parked in the reserved spot by the front door, where customers could see it and understand without being told that the man they were dealing with was doing well for himself. He belonged to the Ames Country Club, played golf on Saturdays when weather allowed, which in Iowa meant roughly 16 Saturdays a year if you were generous with the definition of playable weather. His wife Carol taught third grade at Edwards Elementary. They lived in a four-bedroom house on Ridgewood Drive that they had bought in 1980 for $140,000, and that was now worth $180,000. Four bedrooms for two people. The extra rooms held Carol's sewing projects and Ray's collection of John Deere memorabilia and the accumulated evidence of a lifestyle designed to signal prosperity to anyone who walked through the front door. Ray understood his world perfectly, knew every farmer in 3 counties by name, by acreage, by what they owed and what they could afford. Could look at a man's boots and truck and equipment and tell you within $500 what he would spend. Could read hesitation in a customer's eyes and know whether to push or back off the way a poker player reads the table and knows when to raise and when to fold. Could calculate a monthly payment in his head faster than the financing calculator on his desk. 23 years in the business had taught him to see people clearly, to categorize them, to read the external signals and construct the internal story and proceed with the confidence of a man who has seen 1,000 variations of the same pattern and knows how each one ends. Or so he believed. The truck door opened with a groan of protesting metal. A woman stepped out. She was small, 5'3", maybe 5'4", 61 years old, though she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned long ago that efficiency mattered more than speed. She did not rush, she did not dawdle, she did not waste a single motion on anything that did not serve the task at hand. Every step had a purpose, and the purpose was always the same: get where you are going, do what you came to do, and do not spend 1 ounce of energy on anything that does not contribute. This was the economy of motion that comes from decades of physical work, where the day stretches from before dawn to after dark, and wasted energy is a luxury you cannot afford, because the next fence still needs mending, and the next field still needs plowing, and the animals still need feeding, regardless of how tired you are, or how much your back hurts, or how cold the morning is. She wore faded Carhartt overalls with grease stains so old they had become part of the fabric's pattern. Not a single stain, the kind you get from one afternoon working under a truck. Layers upon layers of stains accumulated over years and decades, each one a record of a specific job, a specific repair, a specific hour spent lying on a concrete floor with a wrench in hand. Engine oil, dark and permanent, soaked deep into the fibers and where no amount of washing would ever reach. Hydraulic fluid amber, where it had not yet oxidized to brown. Gear grease black and thick in smudges along the thighs where she had wiped her hands instinctively while working. Harvester red paint in small spatters along the legs, droplets of pigment that told their own story if you knew how to read them. The overalls were a history, a document, a record of 1,000 hours of mechanical work written in the language of petroleum products on brown canvas, and nobody had ever bothered to read them. Her boots were muddy, not decoratively muddy, not the artful splash of someone who walked through a puddle on the way from the parking lot. Coated, caked. The kind of mud you accumulate by spending the early morning hours in a field, checking soil moisture between your fingers, walking rows doing the daily inventory of a working farm before the rest of the world has finished its first cup of coffee. The mud was dark, almost black. Story County topsoil, some of the richest dirt in the world. The kind of soil that produces 200 bushels of corn per acre when the rain comes right and the temperatures hold, and the 1,000 variables of agriculture align in your favor. She wore a worn International Harvester cap from the 1970s. The red logo had faded to a ghost of itself, barely visible beneath decades of sun and sweat and the accumulated salt of 10,000 hours of outdoor labor. The brim was curved and softened into a permanent arc from years of being grabbed by the bill and adjusted by working hands. The cap was not a fashion statement. It was not nostalgia. It was a relic, a piece of a past she had not let go of, worn without irony or self-consciousness, the way a soldier might wear a unit patch long after the unit had been disbanded. It meant something. What it meant was her business. Her hands were the first thing Ray noticed when she reached the counter. Working hands, scarred across the knuckles where they had slipped off wrenches and made contact with sharp metal edges. Calloused on the palms in the places where wrench handles sit and screwdriver shafts press, and the handles of pliers leave their marks over years of daily use. The nails were short, filed straight across, not shaped or polished, but maintained the way tools are maintained, kept in working order because working is what they do. Grease was permanently embedded in the lines around the cuticles, in the creases of the knuckles, in the whorls of the fingerprints. The kind of grease that does not wash out with soap and water. That becomes part of you. That enters your skin at the molecular level and stays marking you as someone who works with machines the way ink marks a writer's fingers, or chalk marks a teacher's hands, or flour marks a baker's wrists. These were not the hands of a woman who gardened on weekends, or arranged flowers for the church social, or played bridge on Tuesday evenings with other women whose hands were soft and lotioned and adorned with rings that caught the light. These were the hands of someone who pulled wrenches for a living, who tightened bolts and checked torque specifications and rebuilt carburetors and ground valves and measured bearing clearances, and felt the difference between a fit that was right and a fit that was a thousandth of an inch off. Hands that knew their business with an intimacy that only decades of repetition can produce. Maggie Caldwell. Ray knew her. Everyone in Story County knew Maggie Caldwell, or thought they did. Widowed farmer, 280 acres outside Nevada, Iowa, 10 miles east of Ames on County Road E18. Small operation by any standard, by any measure, by any yardstick the agricultural community used to evaluate worth and predict outcomes. The kind of acreage that made other farmers shake their heads slightly when it came up in conversation with the particular mix of pity and superiority that small operations inspire in people who believe that bigger is always better and more is always the correct answer to every question. 280 acres. That is not really farming. That is gardening with a tractor. Her husband, Hank Caldwell, had died in October of 1979. Tractor rollover on their own land in their own field on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of harvest, when the corn was standing tall and golden, and the sky was the kind of blue that only October in Iowa produces. It was the kind of accident that haunted rural communities because it could happen to anyone at any time, and every farmer in the county carried that knowledge in the back of his mind every time he climbed onto a tractor seat. The PTO shaft on their old Farmall caught his jacket sleeve, the heavy canvas cuff of a Carhartt coat he had worn for 15 years, and pulled him under before he could react. The machine did not care that the man it was consuming had spent 30 years maintaining it, improving it, keeping it running through breakdowns and parts shortages, and the thousand small crises of a working farm. The machine simply did what machines do when fabric meets rotating metal at 540 revolutions per minute. Physics does not negotiate. Physics does not consider loyalty or history or love or the 26 years of marriage that were ending in a cornfield on a Tuesday afternoon. Physics simply acts, and the consequences are absolute and irreversible and final. Maggie found him in the field at supper time. She had been in the kitchen making beef stew, the same stew she made every Tuesday, Hank's favorite, with potatoes from the garden and carrots from the root cellar and beef from the steer they had butchered in September. When 6 o'clock came and Hank had not appeared at the back door with his boots in his hand and his cap pushed back on his forehead, the way he always wore it when he was done for the day, she walked out. She did not call his name first. She did not stand on the porch and holler the way farm wives do when supper is getting cold and the men are still in the field burning daylight they do not have. Something in the quality of the silence told her not to call. The silence was wrong. It had a weight to it, a texture like the silence before a storm, when the air thickens and the birds stop singing and every living thing holds still because something is coming that cannot be stopped. She walked across the yard, past the barn, through the gate, into the field. The tractor was still running. The engine was turning that idle, the exhaust note steady and indifferent, the machine continuing to function because nobody had told it to stop. The sky was turning orange in the west, the last light of the day pouring across the field like honey, and the corn around him stood tall enough that nobody driving past on the county road would have seen anything wrong. But Maggie saw. She saw everything, and she carried what she saw for the rest of her life, though she never spoke of it to anyone. Not to the sheriff's deputy who came to take the report, not to the pastor who came with scripture and sympathy, not to the neighbors who came with casseroles and quiet voices and the awkward kindness of people who do not know what to say but know they must say something. Not to Ray Prescott years later sitting on her porch drinking coffee. That image, whatever it was, whatever the last light of an October afternoon revealed in a cornfield in central Iowa, belonged to her alone. She guarded it the way she guarded everything else, with silence, with discipline, with the impenetrable privacy of a woman who had learned that the deepest truths are the ones you carry by yourself. She was 53 when it happened. They had farmed together for 26 years. Married in 1953, the year Eisenhower took office and the Korean War ended, and the price of corn was $1.12 a bushel, and the world was simpler than it would ever be again. No children. It was not something they discussed publicly, and people in Iowa in those years did not ask. The absence was simply noted and filed under the category of things that are nobody's business. It was just the two of them and the land and the tractors and the quiet rhythm of seasons repeating. Planting in spring, growing through summer, harvesting in fall, resting in winter. The four-beat pulse of an agricultural life that had not changed in its essentials since the first plow broke the Iowa prairie and turned the grass under and revealed the black gold beneath. After the funeral, the vultures circled. Ray did not think of them as vultures at the time. Nobody did. They thought of themselves as practical men offering practical solutions to a practical problem. A woman alone on 280 acres in central Iowa in 1979. Everyone knew how that story ended. The arithmetic was simple and merciless, and it pointed in one direction, the same direction it always pointed when a farm wife became a farm widow, and the bank still held paper on the land. The banker from the Farm Credit Office drove out within a week, sat in Maggie's kitchen in Hank's chair, drinking coffee from Hank's mug. The blue one with the chipped handle that Hank had used every morning for 20 years, and explained to the newly widowed farmer, gently, patiently, in the particular tone men used with women they considered incapable of understanding complex matters, that the outstanding mortgage balance was $31,000, and that perhaps it would be best, all things considered, given the circumstances, given her situation, for her to liquidate. That was the word he used, liquidate, a word from the vocabulary of finance, clean and bloodless and efficient, as if the farm and the house and the barn and the fields and the marriage that had soaked into every board and beam and fence post could be dissolved, converted to numbers on a ledger, poured out like water from above, and measured and accounted for and filed away. Two neighbors offered to buy her acreage. Fair price, they said, though the numbers they mentioned were 15% below market value, and both men knew it, and both assumed she would not know the difference because she was a woman and women did not track land prices the way men did. They were not being malicious. They were being opportunistic, which in the farming world was considered a different thing entirely, a kind of practical virtue like being good at judging livestock weight or knowing the right moment to sell grain. Opportunity was not exploitation. It was just business. And business, they believed, was something women did not understand. Her brother-in-law, Hank's older brother, drove down from Waterloo and sat at the same kitchen table and told her with genuine concern and genuine affection to move to town, get a little apartment, find a job at the grocery store or the school cafeteria or the county clerk's office, something suitable, something manageable, something a woman of her age and station could handle without the burden of 280 acres and a mortgage and machinery and the 1,000 daily demands of a working farm that did not care whether the person operating it was male or female or grieving or afraid. Maggie listened to all of them, sat at her kitchen table and listened with the patience and the silence of a woman who has spent decades listening to weather forecasts, taking in the information, assessing its relevance to her situation, sorting the useful from the useless and discarding, without ceremony, everything that does not serve her purpose. She listened to the banker and the neighbors and the brother-in-law and the pastor and the friends and the strangers who meant well and the strangers who did not, and she did not argue, did not cry, did not explain herself, did not justify her decisions or plead for understanding or ask for advice she had not sought. Because explanation requires justification, and justification implies doubt, and Maggie Caldwell did not doubt. Then she paid off the mortgage, every cent, $31,000 drawn from savings nobody knew she had. She drove to the bank in Nevada in the rusty Ford, walked in, wearing the same overalls she had worn to the funeral, stood at the teller window, and presented a check made out to Farm Credit Services of Central Iowa in the amount of $31,000.00. Then she walked to the banker's office, the same banker who had sat in her kitchen and suggested she liquidate, and told him she would not be needing his services anymore. The banker's face changed. It went through three distinct phases like a traffic light, cycling through its colors. First, condescension, the default setting when dealing with farm widows. Second, confusion, the expression of a man whose assumptions have been contradicted by evidence and who has not yet decided whether to adjust the assumptions or reject the evidence. Third, something that might have been respect, though respect that arrives only after being proven wrong is a thin and unreliable currency, and Maggie did not trade in currencies she could not trust. She had not owed money since that day. 8 years now farming alone, 280 acres planted and harvested by a single woman who asked nobody for help and offered no explanations and owed no debts and answered to no authority except the weather and the soil and the seasons and her own unyielding judgment. People talked about her the way people talk about someone who refuses to accept what they consider obvious, with pity dressed up as concern, with worry that was really condescension wearing a more acceptable mask. Poor Maggie, still out there on that little farm, must be barely getting by. Somebody ought to talk to her. It is not right a woman her age alone like that. She ought to sell. She ought to move to town. She ought to accept reality. The pity was sincere. The concern was real. And every word of it was built on a foundation of assumptions that had nothing whatsoever to do with the truth. Maggie pushed through the glass door of the dealership. The showroom gleamed around her like a temple dedicated to the religion of new. 3 brand new John Deere 4050 tractors sat on the polished concrete floor, factory green paint shining under fluorescent lights, with the particular intensity that only new paint achieves, the kind of green so saturated and so perfect, it looks almost artificial, like a color from a brochure rather than a color from the natural world. Price tags starting at $38,000 written in neat black numbers on white cards mounted on chrome stands beside each machine. The smell of new rubber and fresh paint and the chemical sweetness of new upholstery hung in the air like expensive cologne. A banner across the back wall read, "Spring Sale Event," in green and yellow letters 2 feet tall. Ray had ordered it from a printing shop in Des Moines for $50. He believed in appearances. Believed that people made buying decisions based on what they saw, and that what they saw could be managed with the right display and the right lighting and the right message on the right banner at the right time of year. Maggie did not look at any of the new tractors. Not a glance. Not a flicker of interest. Not the briefest pause to admire the paint or read a price tag or wonder what it would feel like to climb into one of those air-conditioned cabs and sit in the cushioned seat and feel the power shift. Transmission respond to the lightest touch. She walked through the showroom the way a person walks through a room that does not contain anything they need or want or care about in the slightest. Straight to the parts counter where Ray stood. Her boots left small crescents of dried mud on the clean floor. Dark crescents of Story County topsoil tracked across polished concrete, like signatures written in a language nobody in the showroom could read. Her face was weathered the way only decades of Iowa wind and sun can weather a face. Deep lines around the eyes from squinting into bright sky and driving rain and blowing snow for 40 years. Creases at the corners of the mouth that might have been from smiling or might have been from setting her jaw against cold wind or difficult circumstances. Skin tanned to the color and texture of good leather. An expression that gave away absolutely nothing. Not hostility, not warmth, not nervousness, not confidence. Nothing. The face of a woman who had decided long ago that her interior life was her own business and that her features were not obligated to broadcast it for the convenience of strangers. "Afternoon, Maggie. What can I do for you?" "I want the Farmall." Ray blinked. "The what?" "The 1962 Farmall 560, the one sitting out back behind the fence. Been there since last August. Red, though, you would not know it from the paint that is left. 8,000 hours on the meter. Needs transmission work, hydraulic rebuild, complete engine overhaul, and new tires at minimum. Am I describing the right machine?" Ray stared at her for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. She had just described the tractor more accurately and more thoroughly than he could have from memory. She had not merely identified it, she had diagnosed it. She had studied it from the road, probably on her way to and from town, over the past 8 months, cataloging its condition through the chain link fence with the practiced eye of someone who knows exactly what she is looking at and exactly what it would take to bring it back. He laughed, not a cruel laugh, not intentionally. The reflexive laugh of a man who thinks he has heard something absurd and is being polite about acknowledging the absurdity. The laugh came naturally the way laughter comes when something does not fit your understanding of how the world works, and your brain reaches for the easiest explanation rather than the correct one. Maggie, that tractor is a piece of junk. I do not say that to be unkind. I say it as a professional assessment from a man who has been in this business for 23 years. It is 25 years old, 8,000 hours on it, which is more than those engines were ever designed to carry without a complete overhaul. Needs transmission work. Hydraulics are shot. The pump is weeping bay, the cylinders are scored, the lines are cracked and brittle, paint is gone. What is left is more rust than red. Tires are half worn, front axle bushings are sloppy. Electrical system is a disaster because mice have been living in the wiring harness since August. It has been sitting in the weather all winter. Rain, snow, ice, wind, everything Iowa can throw at a machine. I listed it at 8,000 when I took it in trade. Got 2 phone calls and no serious offers in 8 months. It is worth maybe 4,000 as scrap. Maybe. On a generous day to a generous buyer. How much? Why would you want that when I have 3 beautiful new 405s right here? He gestured at the showroom with the practiced sweep of a man who has made this gesture 1,000 times. She could finance one for about $400 a month. 5-year term at 12% manageable for any working farm operation. Modern equipment with a factory warranty. Full parts support from the Deere & Company network. Air-conditioned cab with AM/FM radio and heat. Power shift transmission. Front wheel assist. Electronic monitoring systems. Everything a farmer could want in 1987. Every advantage that 25 years of engineering progress could provide over a worn-out machine from the Kennedy administration. How much for the Farmall? Ray studied her face. The expression behind those weathered features was not amusement, not confusion, not the befuddlement of someone who has wandered into the wrong conversation. It was purpose, clean, clear, undiluted purpose. The kind that does not announce itself because it does not need to. The kind that simply exists like gravity and everything in its vicinity adjusts to its presence. 6,000 cash. The words landed on the counter between them like a stone dropped in still water. Clean, heavy, undeniable. Excuse me, $6,000 cash today. I will bring the money this afternoon. You will have it in your hand before the bank closes. Maggie, be reasonable. That tractor is going to cost you more in repairs than it is worth. I have seen it happen. Farmers buy old equipment thinking they are saving money, and they spend twice the purchase price trying to make it run. I have financing options that could put you in something modern for, I do not want new. I want that Farmall. 6,000 cash. Are you selling or not? There was something in her voice. Not anger, not stubbornness, though people would later use that word because stubbornness was the word they reserved for women who refused to take advice. Something quieter than both. A certainty so deep it did not need volume. The certainty of someone who has considered all the options and arrived at a conclusion that requires no further discussion, no validation, no approval from anyone standing behind a parts counter in a green polo shirt. Tell you what, you bring me 6,000 cash this afternoon and the Farmall is yours. But I am telling you right now you are making a mistake. I will take my chances. She left. Ray watched the rusty Ford pull away. He turned to Dennis Kowalski, his sales manager. Dennis was 34, ambitious, hungry for commission. Can you believe that Maggie Caldwell wants to spend $6,000 on a 25-year-old Farmall instead of getting a nice new $4,050 on payments? Dennis shook his head. That woman has been farming alone since her husband died. Probably saved that $6,000 over 5 years by not buying groceries. Old farmer, old truck, old tractor. At least she is consistent. They both laughed. 2 men in a clean showroom laughing at a woman in dirty overalls. It did not feel like cruelty at the time. It felt like common sense. Ray would remember that laughter for the rest of his life. She returned at 2:15 that afternoon, walked in carrying a paper grocery bag from Hy-Vee, set it on the counter, opened it. Stacks of $20 bills, bundled with rubber bands, 50s, hundreds. Old bills, every one of them, worn soft from years of handling. The kind of money someone takes out of a safe and counts and replaces and takes out and counts again. Money that lives in darkness and comes into the light only when it has somewhere specific to go. That is $6,000. Count it. He did. 10 minutes, 20s, 50s, hundreds, 6,000 exactly. The other customers had stopped what they were doing. Two farmers at the parts counter watched openly. Dennis stood behind Ray, staring at the cash. Where did you get 6,000 in cash, Maggie? Saved it. You keep $6,000 in cash at your house. I keep more than that, but 6 is what the tractor costs. Something shifted. A hairline crack in the wall of assumptions Ray had built around Maggie Caldwell. Small enough to ignore. Almost. They signed the papers. Ray handed over the title and keys. She is all yours. You hauling it today. Tomorrow. Maggie. Seriously, why that old Farmall? She met his eyes. For the first time, Ray saw something behind the weathered calm. A flash of something bright and certain. Like sunlight reflecting off water at the bottom of a deep well. Going to farm with it. You already have tractors. I have seen you running a 73 International 1056. That is better than this Farmall by a mile. The 1056 is good, but I wanted the Farmall too. Why? Maggie smiled. The expression transformed her face completely. For one moment, she was not the widow everyone pitied. She was someone with a secret worth keeping. You will see. She left. Ray told the story to everyone that week. Old Maggie Caldwell bought that beat-up Farmall for 6,000 cash. Carried the money in a grocery bag. Can you believe it? The salesman laughed. Dennis told the story at a dealer meeting in Des Moines. The widow farmer with the grocery bag. Like something out of a movie. Except in a movie, she would be secretly rich. Everyone laughed at that too. But Ray could not shake one detail. She had said she kept more than 6,000 in cash at home. How much more? And how did a widow running 280 acres alone accumulate that kind of reserve? Over the next 2 weeks, stories drifted in. The way news travels in small-town Iowa. In pieces. First, from Carl Jensen at the implement shop in Nevada. Maggie bought a complete engine rebuild kit for the Farmall. $470, paid cash. Knew the part numbers by heart. Second, from the tire shop on Highway 30. 4 new rear tires. Titan 16.938 and $840. Cash. The owner said she knew more about tire specifications than half the dealers in the county. Third, from the paint supplier names. 50 gallons of Harvester Red implement, paint plus primer hardener and reducer. $260. Cash. She asked technical questions about mixing ratios that the supplier could not answer. She ended up telling him the correct formulas. Ray sat at his desk one evening and did the math on a yellow legal pad. 6,000 for the tractor, 470 for the engine kit, 840 for tires, 260 for paint. Other supplies she had probably bought that he had not heard about. She was well over $8,000 into this project. Probably closer to 10, 14,000 total invested in a machine he had considered scrap. Something does not add up with Maggie Caldwell, he said aloud in the empty office. He wrote it on the legal pad, underlined it, slid the pad into his desk drawer, and went home. He did not think about it again until early May. He was driving east on County Road E18 heading to a service call at a farm outside Colo. The road ran past Maggie's place. 280 acres of black Iowa soil, white farmhouse, red barn, machine shed. He had driven past 100 times without a second glance, but something caught his eye. Color. Bright, unmistakable Harvester Red gleaming in the May sunlight from inside the open machine shed. Ray slowed, then stopped, then stared. The Farmall 560 was parked in the shed, and it was not the tractor he had sold. It was perfect, not repaired, not fixed up, restored. Completely, thoroughly, impossibly restored. Harvester Red paint so deep and flawless it looked wet. New tires black and sharp-edged. Chrome exhaust stack catching sunlight like a mirror. Seat recovered in correct material. Sheet metal straightened to factory specs. Every bolt, every fitting, either replaced or cleaned to gleaming. Ray pulled into the driveway, got out, walked to the shed on legs that felt unsteady. Up close, the tractor was stunning. He had seen professional restorations at farm shows. Tractors that collectors spent $50,000 having rebuilt by shops with climate-controlled paint booths. This matched those, maybe exceeded them. The paint alone was remarkable. 5 coats minimum wet sanded between each, buffed to a mirror finish. Even the factory chalk marks on the engine block quality control marks from 1962 small white X's and a blue circle near the serial plate were reproduced accurately. Inspector marks that only someone who had studied original Farmalls in obsessive detail would know existed. Maggie emerged from the barn, same overalls, same cap, grease on her cheek. Afternoon, Ray. Maggie, you restored it. I did. How this is museum quality. I have been restoring tractors for 30 years. I know how to do it right. This must have taken hundreds of hours. About 400. Evenings and weekends over 6 weeks. 400 hours. A woman alone in a barn with hand tools and a paint gun turning scrap into a masterpiece. While the rest of Story County assumed she was barely surviving. Why put this much work into a 25-year-old tractor? Come with me. I want to show you something. They walked to the barn. Maggie pulled the door open. Inside, bare bulbs hung from the rafters, casting warm golden light across clean concrete. Ray stopped walking. 5 tractors, 5 vintage International harvesters lined up in a row, all perfectly restored, all gleaming. A 1951 Farmall H Cherry Red Pristine, a 1956 Farmall 450, flawless, a 1960 Farmall 560 restored years earlier, a 1965 International 706, immaculate, a 1970 International 1056, perfect condition. 5 resurrections, 5 machines the world had discarded, brought back by a single woman working alone. Ray stood in the doorway and felt his understanding of the world rearrange itself. You did all of these, over 30 years. I buy worn-out tractors cheap, restore them perfectly. Some I keep, some I sell. You sell them. For how much? Depends. The Farmall H I sold last year brought $18,000 at auction, $18,000. The 450 brought $22,000. The 706 I will sell this fall should bring 25 to 30. How many have you restored? 63 total. Sold 48, kept 15. Average profit on the ones you sold, about $8,000 per tractor. Ray did the math. 48 times 8,000, $384,000. About that, Maggie said, 12,800 per year average. Hank taught me, she said. Her voice changed when she said his name, softened in a way that made the air in the barn feel different. My husband. He showed me how to take something broken and make it beautiful again. We restored our first tractor together in '57, a worn-out Farmall for $200. Fixed it up, sold it for $900, made $700 profit. We were hooked. We were like email. She touched the fender of the Farmall H. After he died, everyone told me to sell the farm. The bankers said a woman could not run a farm alone. I paid off the mortgage, every cent. Then I went into the barn and started the next restoration. Every tractor I restore, I talk to Hank. Tell him about the engine, the paint, the parts I found. Sounds foolish. An old woman talking to the air in a barn. But when I am working, he is right there with me. I can hear him telling me to check the ring gaps one more time, to sand between coats, to get the torque specs right, to not rush, to do it once and do it right. Her eyes were bright but steady. The restoration is how I kept going after he died. It was not just money, it was purpose, connection, a reason to get up every morning when the house was empty and the silence was louder than any noise I had ever heard. The tractors saved me. Hank saved me even after he was gone because he left me the skills and the love for the work and the understanding that broken things can be made beautiful again. To understand what Maggie Caldwell had built in that barn, you had to understand her method. The method was the same for every tractor, had been the same since 1957 when she and Hank restored that first worn-out Farmall together and discovered that the work itself was the reward and the money was just the evidence that the work had been done correctly. Take the 1962 Farmall 560 that Ray had sold her in April. Here is exactly how Maggie turned a $6,000 wreck into a $32,000 masterpiece. Week 1. Complete disassembly. Maggie started by photographing every angle of the tractor from every direction, took over 200 photos with a Polaroid camera she had used since 1973, documented the original configuration, the routing of every wire, the position of every clamp, the location of every bracket. Because when you take a machine apart completely down to the last bolt and washer, the only way to put it back together correctly is to know exactly how it looked before you started. Then she began the disassembly itself. Every bolt, every nut, every washer, every cotter pin went into labeled coffee cans. She had a system. Front axle bolts in one can, steering column hardware in another, hydraulic pump mounting fasteners in a third, engine head bolts in a fourth. By the time the disassembly was complete, she had over 400 coffee cans lined up on shelves in her barn, each one labeled in her small, precise handwriting, with a description of the contents and the location on the tractor where they belonged. The engine came out first. Maggie used a homemade hoist she and Hank had built in 1962 from scrap steel and a 2-ton chainfall they had bought at a farm auction for $40. The hoist had lifted probably 100 engines over the decades. The chainfall was original, still working, still smooth, because Maggie maintained her tools the way she maintained everything else with meticulous care and regular attention. The engine weighed 850 pounds. It took Maggie 4 hours working alone to extract it safely. She did not rush. She did not take shortcuts. She checked every chain hook twice, positioned the hoist precisely over the center of gravity, lifted slowly an inch at a time, watching for any sign of imbalance, any indication that the weight was shifting in a direction she had not anticipated. 4 hours for a job that a shop with 2 mechanics and an overhead crane could do in 30 minutes. But Maggie was not competing with a shop. She was doing the work the way Hank had taught her, which was the right way, which was the only way. Transmission came next. Then the hydraulic system, piece by piece, pump and cylinders and lines coiled and tagged. Then the sheet metal panels removed carefully, each one photographed before removal to document the exact position and angle. Then wheels and tires. Then the electrical system, which on this particular tractor was a disaster, mice having colonized the wiring harness and chewed through insulation in a dozen places. By the end of week 1, the Farmall was completely disassembled. The frame sat bare on jack stands in the center of the barn, like the skeleton of a large animal. Parts organized on shelves and workbenches around the perimeter. 400 coffee cans gleaming dully in the barn light. And Maggie alone looking at the work ahead the way a painter looks at a blank canvas, seeing not what is there but what will be there when she is finished. Week 2. Cleaning and assessment. Every part got cleaned. Maggie used 3 methods depending on the component and its condition. Small parts went into a homemade tumbler. A 55-gallon drum mounted on a motor-driven shaft filled with walnut shell medium. She had built the tumbler in 1968 from parts she found at a surplus auction. The motor was from an old washing machine. The drum was from an oil company. The shaft was a piece of cold-rolled steel she had turned on Hank's lathe. The tumbler ran for 6 hours per batch, rotating slowly, the walnut shells scouring the surfaces of bolts and brackets and fittings until they came out looking like they had just been manufactured. Medium parts got wire brushed and degreased by hand. Maggie spent 8 hours with a wire wheel on her bench grinder, cleaning rust and old paint off every piece of sheet metal, every bracket, every mounting plate. The wire wheel threw sparks and fragments of rust and old paint in a cloud that covered her overalls and cap and face in a fine reddish-brown dust. She wore safety glasses and nothing else for protection because she had been doing this for 30 years, and the dust was as familiar to her as the smell of coffee in the morning. Large parts got sandblasted: the frame, the engine block, the transmission case, the axle housings. Maggie borrowed a sandblaster from her neighbor, a farmer named Ed Kirkpatrick, in exchange for helping with his harvest every fall. Had been making the same trade for 20 years. The sandblaster was industrial grade, powerful enough to strip paint and rust from cast iron in minutes, and Maggie spent 2 full days blasting every major component down to bare metal. When she was finished, the parts gleamed with the dull silver of clean steel, ready for primer, ready for paint, ready to begin their second life. After cleaning assessment, Maggie went through every component with the eye of a surgeon examining a patient. Made a list on a yellow legal pad. Engine complete, rebuild required. Pistons, rings, bearings, valves, gaskets, all needed replacement. Transmission, new clutch 3 gears with worn teeth, all seals. Hydraulics, pump rebuild, new lines, new cylinders. Sheet metal, 3 panels needed replacement. Hood had a crack, 1 fender had rusted through. Electrical complete, rewiring required. Tires, all 4 new. Total parts cost estimated at $4,200. But Maggie never bought parts at retail prices. That was for amateurs. She had sources accumulated over 30 years, a network of suppliers and salvage specialists and fellow restorers who knew her name and her standards and her ability to identify exactly what she needed without wasting anyone's time. Engine rebuild kit from Tennessee Tractor Parts, a company that specialized in international harvester components. Maggie had maintained an account there since 1964, Commercial pricing. Kit costs $680 instead of $900 retail. Transmission parts from a salvage yard in Illinois. A man named Ralph who specialized in Farmall transmissions and kept a warehouse full of gears and shafts and bearings organized by model and year. $340 for everything she needed. Hydraulic components from another specialist in Wisconsin. $260. Sheet metal from a parts tractor she found at auction. A 1960 Farmall 560 with good tin but a blown engine. Bought the whole tractor for $900. Used the hood and fender she needed. Sold the remaining parts to other restorers for $600. Net cost for the sheet metal, $300. Wiring harness she made herself. Bought wire by the spool and connectors in bulk. $120 total versus $400 for a pre-made harness. And her harness was better because she routed every wire exactly where the factory had routed it in 1962, using the photographs she had taken during disassembly as her guide. Total actual parts cost $3,790, $410 saved through smart sourcing. The engine rebuild took weeks. Maggie had rebuilt probably 200 engines in her life, could do it with her eyes closed by touch and sound, and the particular feel of parts fitting together the way they were designed to fit. Engine blocks to the machine shop for bore and hone, $220. She picked it up in the old Ford and brought it home and did the rest herself. Installing pistons and rings. One full day. Maggie measured ring gaps with a feeler gauge, checking each one twice, adjusting until the gap was exactly 15 thousandths of an inch. Perfect compression. Installing bearings. Half a day. Main bearings and rod bearings, each one checked with Plastigauge to verify the oil clearance was within factory specifications. 2 thousandths of an inch. No room for error. No room for approximation. Either the clearance was right or it was not, and Maggie did not accept not. Valves. She ground the valve faces on a valve grinder she had bought used in 1971 for $200. That grinder had saved her thousands over the decades, paying for itself in the first year and continuing to pay dividends for 30 more. Lapped each valve by hand with grinding compound and a suction cup rotating the valve against the seat with a back and forth motion that was part muscle memory and part meditation until the seat showed a perfect ring of contact all the way around. Perfect seal. Every valve. Assembly took 2 days. Every bolt torqued to specification with a torque wrench that Maggie calibrated annually by hanging known weights from the handle and marking the scale. Every clearance checked 3 times. When the engine was finished, it looked factory new. Better than factory new because Maggie's standards exceeded the factory standards the way an artist's standards exceed a printer's. The engine would run another 20,000 hours easily. 50 years of service waiting inside a block of cast iron that had been born in Rock Island, Illinois in 1961 and reborn in a barn in Nevada, Iowa in 1987. The paint was where Maggie's artistry showed most clearly. Anyone with mechanical skills can bolt parts together. Anyone with patience can rebuild an engine, but few people can paint like Maggie Caldwell painted. Sheet metal's preparation took 2 full weeks. Every panel sanded smooth with progressively finer grits of sandpaper, starting at 80 and ending at 400. Every dent worked out with a body hammer and a dolly tapping the metal back into its original contours with the patience of a sculptor working clay. Every imperfection filled with body filler and shaped perfectly sanded until the surface was so smooth you could not feel the transition between filler and metal with your fingertips. 3 coats of implement primer. Sanded between coats with 600 grit paper. Surface like glass. Paint. Single-stage harvester red, implement enamel. Maggie mixed it herself to the exact 1962 formula, adjusting the ratio of pigment to reducer to hardener, based on the temperature and humidity in the barn, because paint behaves differently at 50 degrees than it does at 70, and differently at 40% humidity than at 60, and the only way to know the right mixture is to have mixed it 1,000 times before and learned the feel of paint that is ready to spray. She applied it with a professional HVLP spray gun she had bought used in 1979 for $300. 5 coats. Wet sanded between each coat with 1,500 grit paper. The final coat color sanded with 2,000 grit and buffed with machine polish until the surface was mirror smooth. Better than factory, better than any factory that ever existed, because factories work on production schedules, and Maggie worked on perfection schedules, and those are not the same thing. Decals. Correct 1962 Farmall decals from a restoration supplier in Indiana, applied precisely using the photographs from the original disassembly to verify the position of each decal to within a 16th of an inch. Sealed with clear coat. Reassembly was the reverse of disassembly. Engine back in, transmission mounted, hydraulics installed, sheet metal fitted. Every bolt from every coffee can returned to its exact original location, torqued to the exact specification listed in the International Harvester Shop Manual that Maggie had owned since 1959. New seat recovered in the correct brown vinyl by an upholsterer in Ames, who Maggie had been using since 1970. Chrome exhaust stack polished with metal polish in a cotton rag until it reflected her face like a mirror. Every bolt head painted if it was supposed to be painted. Left bare if it was supposed to be bare. Even the factory chalk marks on the engine block, the quality control marks that the inspectors at the Rock Island plant had made in 1962, reproduced in the correct colors, with the correct symbols in the correct locations. 400 hours, 24 weeks. One woman, working alone in a barn in Iowa, talking to her dead husband as she worked building something the world did not know it needed until it saw it finished. Total investment, $6,000 purchase price, plus $3,790 in parts, plus 400 hours of labor. If Maggie valued her labor at $15 an hour, the total cost was $15,790. But Maggie did not value her labor. To her, the 400 hours spent in the barn were not work. They were entertainment. Better than television. More satisfying than golf. Cheaper than most hobbies. And infinitely more profitable because at the end of 400 hours of television, you have nothing. And at the end of 400 hours of restoration, you have a masterpiece. Ray stood surrounded by 30 years of grief transformed into art. He had laughed at this woman, had told the story as a joke, had let Dennis mock her at a dealer meeting. Maggie, I owe you an apology. I laughed at you, called you crazy behind your back, assumed you could not afford better. I was completely wrong. Most people assume that. I let them. Makes life easier. But why? Why let people think you are struggling? Because it keeps me out of trouble. Nobody asks me for money. Nobody tries to sell me things I do not need. I am just old Maggie with the rusty truck. That is fine with me. Invisibility is not a burden. It is a tool. Come inside, she said. I want to show you something else. In her small office off the kitchen, Maggie opened a file cabinet and pulled out bank statements. 3 accounts, 3 banks. Story County State Bank, $214,000. Wells Fargo Des Moines, $261,000. Principal Financial, $143,000. Total, $618,000. Plus about $140,000 in cash in my safe. And the farm, 280 acres, worth about $450,000. Equipment, about $80,000. Total net worth is about $1,300,000. The silence in the small office was absolute. Outside, a meadowlark sang. Inside, Ray Prescott felt the architecture of his worldview collapse. $1.3 million. The woman in the worn overalls. The woman with the rusty truck. The woman the whole county pitied. A millionaire. He thought about every time he had seen her at the feed mill and felt his comfortable superiority. He had been performing success. She had been building it. He spent $75,000 a year to look successful. She spent $12,000 a year to be successful. The shame came in waves. Deep structural shame. The shame of realizing you have been living inside an error for decades. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an entire change of mind. You do not owe me anything. You just needed to see something you had not seen before. Most people never do. I know what you told people, Maggie said calmly. I heard about Dennis at the dealer meeting. The widow farmer with the grocery bag. It does not bother me. Every person who underestimates me is one less person trying to interfere with my life. But I do not think about it much. I just do what I enjoy. Farm, restore tractors, save money, live simple. Ray drove back to his dealership that evening in a state he could only describe as altered. The familiar road looked different. The corn pushing through black soil looked different. The dealership, when he had pulled out of it that morning, had looked like his kingdom, his domain, the place where he understood the rules and controlled the outcomes. Now it looked like a stage set, the props of a life designed to be seen rather than lived. The green tractors in the showroom were not products anymore. They were symbols. symbols of a system that took from the people it claimed to serve and called the taking a service. He sat in his parked Buick for 15 minutes, engine off, windows up, hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Staring at the dealership facade, the big John Deere sign, the showroom windows reflecting the early evening sky, the parking lot where that rusty Ford had pulled in 6 weeks ago, carrying a woman in a grocery bag, and a truth that Ray had been too blind and too proud and too comfortable to see. He ran the numbers, not on paper, in his head, the way he had run numbers his entire career, except now the numbers were about his own life instead of someone else's financing terms. Maggie Caldwell, $47,000 in total annual income, $35,000 from farming, $12,000 from tractor restorations. Lived on $12,000 a year. That was $1,000 a month. Rent equivalent of zero because the house was paid for. Food cost minimal because she grew most of it in her garden and canned it and stored it and ate from the land the way farm women had eaten from the land for 100 years. Clothing cost negligible because she wore the same overalls until they disintegrated and bought replacements at the farm store for $30. Utilities on a small farmhouse, maybe $2,000 a year. Insurance, maybe $1,500. Property taxes on 280 acres, about $4,000. Fuel and basic vehicle maintenance on the old Ford, maybe another $2,000. Everything else, coffee, books, tractor manuals, occasional hardware, maybe $500. $12,000 a year, total, for everything, for a life that included a paid-for house and a paid-for farm, and no debt of any kind, and the freedom to do exactly what she wanted every day of her life. Saved $35,000 every year for decades. Ray Prescott, $80,000 a year from the dealership between salary and commissions, and the occasional bonus from Deere and Company for meeting regional targets. $75,000 spent on lifestyle. The house on Ridgewood, $1,800 a month in mortgage and taxes and insurance, and the constant small repairs that a 4-bedroom house demands from its occupants, like a pet that needs feeding. The Buick, $380 a month. Carol's Oldsmobile, $290. Country Club, $4,000 a year, which included the initiation fee amortized over 10 years, and the monthly dues and the food minimum. They never quite met because neither of them actually enjoyed the restaurant. Vacations, $8,000 to $10,000 annually. Florida in January, Colorado in July, long weekends in Chicago twice a year. Dining out, $300 a month because Tuesday was Italian and Friday was the steakhouse, and Sunday was brunch after church. And these rituals had become fixed points in their calendar, unmovable and unquestioned, the way holidays are unmovable and unquestioned, even when nobody can remember why they started. Clothing for Ray, $2,000 a year. Clothing for Carol, $3,000. Gifts for birthdays and holidays, and the weddings of people they barely knew, another $2,000. Cable television, newspaper subscriptions, magazine subscriptions, the lawn service because Ray did not own a mower and considered yard work beneath his station. The cleaning service every other week because Carol was tired when she got home from teaching and the house was too big for 2 people to maintain without help. $75,000 a year for the appearance of prosperity. Net savings, about $5,000. Maybe, in a good year, in a bad year when the furnace died or the Buick needed a transmission or Carol's dental work exceeded what insurance covered, the savings went to zero or negative. Ray made more money than Maggie. Maggie kept more money than Ray. And the difference between making and keeping was the difference between a man worth $200,000 and a woman worth $1.3 million. It was the difference between a life built on debt and display and a life built on ownership and purpose. It was the difference between sleeping well and lying awake, between freedom and obligation, between choosing your life and having your life chosen for you by the monthly statements that arrived in the mailbox like invoices from a landlord you could never satisfy. Who was really successful? The question sat in his chest like a coal, not burning, glowing, the kind of heat that does not consume but illuminates. He told Carol that night, lay in bed in the dark, and told her everything. The tractors in the barn, the bank statements, the $1.3 million, the cash in the safe. Carol listened without interrupting, which told Ray that she understood this was not a casual story. A millionaire, Carol said when he finished. The word hung in the dark bedroom like a lantern. On paper, at least. Probably more with the quiche and the equipment and the land appreciation. And nobody knows. Nobody. She lives like she has nothing, works like she has nothing. Nobody pays attention to her. Carol was quiet for a long time. Ray could hear her breathing, could hear the clock ticking, could hear faintly the sound of a barn owl somewhere in the trees along Squaw Creek. "That is the smartest thing I have ever heard," Carol said. "Why?" "Because she is free. Nobody expects anything from her. Nobody asks anything of her. She does not have to perform success for anyone. She just lives." "When is the last time we just lived, Ray? When is the last time we did something because we wanted to instead of because it would look right?" The word landed in Ray's mind like a key turning in a lock. Performance. That was what his life had become. The house was a performance. The Buick was a performance. The country club was a performance. The dealer awards were a performance. The pressed khakis and the logo shirts and the firm handshake and the confident smile were all performances. Every piece of his carefully constructed life was designed not for his own satisfaction, but for other people's perception. He was living for an audience. Had been living for an audience for so long, he had forgotten there was any other way to live. Maggie did not perform. Maggie simply was. The next morning, Ray called her at 7. Her phone rang 6 times before she answered, slightly out of breath. "Had been in the barn already." "Can I come talk to you? I have questions." "Come on over. Coffee is on." He drove to the farm. They sat on the porch. Same chairs, same coffee, strong and black and brewed without apology. Same view of the fields stretching east to the tree line. "Teach me, how do you do it? How do you live so cheap and save so much?" Maggie thought for a moment, her working hands wrapped around the mug. "It is not complicated. I own everything outright. No payments means no pressure. No interest means no drain. I fix what breaks instead of replacing it. I buy quality used instead of cheap new. I do not care what people think of my truck or clothes. And I only spend money on things that matter." "What matters?" "Good food. I grow most of it. Reliable equipment that I can maintain myself. Tools for my work. Books. Coffee. Everything else is noise. Noise that costs money." "Do you not want nice things?" "A new truck. A bigger house." "Why my truck runs? My house is comfortable. New does not make me happier. It just costs more and worries more." She set the mug down and looked at her hands, turned them over slowly, examining the scars and calluses. "These hands have rebuilt 200 engines, painted 63 tractors. Some women my age have soft hands. I have capable hands. I would not trade them." Hank and I learned early. When we first married, we had nothing. Absolutely nothing. A rented 40 and a worn-out tractor and each other. And we were happy. Happiest years of my life. We never forgot that. The things did not make the happiness. We did. After Hank died, I could have spent money trying to fill the hole. But grief is not a problem. Money solves. Work solves it. Purpose solves it. The tractors mattered. The farm mattered. The savings mattered because they meant freedom. She looked out at the fields. "Freedom is the thing, Ray, not the money. The money is just how you keep score. Freedom is the actual prize. Freedom to farm how I want. Freedom to spend my time on work I love. Freedom to say no to things I do not need. Freedom to sleep well every night without debt and worry gnawing at me in the dark. That is real wealth. Everything else is accounting." "What about farming?" 280 acres. Everyone around you is expanding." "No, 280 is enough. More land means more debt, more equipment, more stress. I watched neighbors expand to 2,000 acres and lose everything in the 80s. Good men who knew farming but did not know how to say no to the banker. They are gone now. I stayed small and kept everything." "Do you ever regret not growing bigger?" "I have slept well every night for 40 years. No debt collectors, no worries about payments. That piece is worth more than acreage." If you could go back to 57, what would you tell yourself? Buy used. Fix everything yourself. Never borrow money. Save aggressively. Ignore what everyone else is doing because what everyone else is doing is usually wrong. Find something you love that makes money. And do not let anyone else define what enough looks like. Enough is whatever lets you live free. Ray asked the question he had been building toward all morning, the one that sat underneath all the others, the one about time. How long did it take you to stop caring what people thought? Maggie set her mug on the porch railing and looked at him with an expression that was part amusement and part something harder to name. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition of a teacher who has just heard a student ask the right question for the first time. "About 15 years, she said, maybe 20. It is not something that happens all at once. It is something that happens in layers. First, you stop caring about the opinions of strangers. That is the easy part. Strangers do not know you, so their opinions are just noise. And once you recognize noise for what it is, you can tune it out the way you tune out the sound of the interstate when you live near the highway. Then you stop caring about the opinions of acquaintances. The people at church who look at your truck and calculate your net worth and get the answer wrong. The women at the grocery store who notice your clothes and feel sorry for you. The men at the feed mill who shake their heads and say, "Poor Maggie." That takes longer because these are people you see every week. People whose faces are familiar. People who exist in the same space as you. And their opinions carry a weight that stranger opinions do not simply because of proximity. Then you stop caring about the opinions of friends. And that is the hardest part because friends are supposed to know you. And when friends misunderstand you, when friends pity you or judge you, or assume things about your life that are not true, the temptation is to correct them. To explain. To say, actually, you have it wrong. Actually, I am doing fine. Actually, I have more money than you do. But if you explain, you give away the privacy, and the privacy is worth more than the approval. So you let friends believe what they believe, and you carry the truth silently, the way you carry a good tool in your pocket. You know it is there. You know what it can do. And that is enough. She looked at the fields. Hank never cared what anyone thought. Not for one day of his life. He wore what he wore, and drove what he drove, and farmed how he farmed, and if someone had a problem with any of it, that was their problem, not his. I admired that about him from the day we met. He was the freest person I had ever known, and I think that is why I fell in love with him. Not because he was handsome, though he was, in a rough kind of way. Not because he was smart, though he was plenty smart. Because he was free. Because he answered to nobody except himself and the land and the weather, and those three things were honest in a way that people rarely are. After he died, I had two choices. I could start caring what people thought because he was not there anymore to not care for both of us. Or I could become what he had been. I could carry his freedom forward. I could be the person who does not explain and does not apologize and does not perform and does not need anything from anyone except the opportunity to work and the space to be left alone. I chose the second option, and it is the best decision I have made since marrying him. She picked up her mug. You are learning this at 47? That is not too late. Most people never learn it at all. They spend their whole lives chasing the approval of people who do not matter, buying things they do not need to impress people. They do not like borrowing money to fund a lifestyle that does not make them happy. And they die in debt, and they die exhausted, and they die never having known what freedom tastes like. You have a chance to taste it. Do not waste it. Ray wrote that down too, every word, because Maggie Caldwell's words were not conversation. They were instructions, a manual for a life he had not yet built, but could see clearly for the first time. The blueprint of a house with no mortgage and no pretense and no performance and no debt. A house built on the same foundation Maggie had built hers on. Ownership, discipline, privacy, purpose, the understanding that enough is not a limitation but a liberation. They sat on the porch for another hour. The morning warmed. The fields shimmered in the growing heat. A tractor worked in the distance, the sound rising and falling with the breeze. Maggie told him about the first time she and Hank sold a restored tractor, a 1949 Farmall M, in 1959 for $900. How they sat at their kitchen table that evening with the check between them and looked at each other and knew without speaking that they had found the second engine of their financial life. The farm was the first engine, steady and reliable, producing income year after year, the way a field produces corn, predictably, and within a known range. The restorations were the second engine, variable and unpredictable. Some years producing a lot, and some years producing a little, but over time accumulating a reserve that no bank could touch and no market could erode. Two engines, Maggie said. That is the secret. One engine will keep you alive. Two engines will make you rich. The farm kept us alive. The tractors made us rich. Find your second engine, Ray. Something you love. Something you are good at. Something that puts money in your pocket while the world is not watching. Ray thought about that all the way back to Ames. His first engine was the dealership. What was his second? He did not have one. He had one source of income and one way to earn it and one set of skills and one path forward. If the dealership failed, he failed. If the industry contracted, he contracted. He had no safety net, no backup plan, no hidden reservoir of skill and income that operated independently of his primary occupation. Maggie had built exactly that, a parallel life, a hidden economy, a business that existed entirely under the radar, producing income and building wealth and developing skills, while the visible world looked at her and saw nothing but a struggling widow in worn overalls. The genius of it was the invisibility. Because nobody knew about the restoration business, nobody interfered with it. Nobody tried to tax it or regulate it or compete with it or buy it out or franchise it or scale it or turn it into something it was not. It was pure. It was hers. It was Hank's gift to her and her gift to herself, and the world had no claim on it because the world did not know it existed. Ray did not find a second engine, not in the way Maggie had found hers. He was not a craftsman. He did not have Maggie's mechanical genius or her artistic eye or her patience for the 1,000-hour solitary labor that a perfect restoration demanded. But he found something else, something that served the same purpose in a different way. He became a teacher, not in a classroom, on the sales floor and in the shop, and on Saturday mornings at the maintenance clinics, and in the living rooms and kitchens and barns of farmers across central Iowa who needed someone to tell them the truth about equipment and money and debt and the mathematics of survival. Ray Prescott became the man who told farmers the truth, and the truth spoken consistently and without agenda over many years became its own kind of wealth. A wealth of trust, a wealth of reputation, a wealth of relationships that paid dividends, not in dollars, but in loyalty and referrals, and the particular satisfaction of knowing that the people who bought from you were better off for having done so. It was not Maggie's second engine, but it was his, and it worked. Ray wrote it all down, filled 6 pages in a small notebook. Not because Maggie was trying to teach. She was simply describing her life. The teaching was inherent in the description. That week, a young farmer walked into the showroom, 26 years old, Justin Kreider, third-generation farmer trying to hold 400 acres outside Gilbert. Old tractor had blown a head gasket. He needed equipment. Justin wanted to finance a new 4,050, $38,000, 7-year note, $540 a month. The old Ray would have had the paperwork done in 20 minutes. The new Ray saw a 26-year-old standing at the edge of a cliff. "Justin, can you spare a couple of hours?" They drove to an equipment auction in Marshalltown. Ray walked Justin through the lots, pointed out a '78 John Deere 403, in good condition, solid tractor, not fancy, but functional. The 4030 sold for $11,400. You just saved $27,000. That 403 will do everything the 4050 does. Put the money you would have spent on payments into savings. You are a dealer. Why are you not selling me new? Because I am tired of watching farmers go broke buying equipment they cannot afford. Someone taught me that. Dennis Kowalski was waiting when Ray got back, arms crossed, face hard. You just talked a customer out of a $38,000 sale, a customer who was ready to sign. What is wrong with you? Nothing is wrong with me. Something has been wrong with how we do business, and I am fixing it. That kid was going to finance 38 at 12% for 7 years. He would have paid $58,000 total on 400 acres in a soft market. One bad year and he loses the farm. I will not do that anymore. You have lost your mind. We sell tractors. We push financing. That is how we make money. We make money. They lose farms. I have been part of that for 23 years. I am done. They stood on opposite sides of a line neither could cross. 2 men who had built a business together now looking at each other across an unbridgeable gap. Dennis saw a dealer abandoning his purpose. Ray saw a dealer finally finding his. The next morning, Dennis resigned, cleaned out his desk, took a job with a competitor in Ankeny who still believed in aggressive volume sales. You could have been the biggest dealer in central Iowa. You are throwing it all away because some old widow told you a story. Ray watched Dennis drive away in his leased Chevrolet and felt something he had not felt in years. Certainty. He did not know it then, but Dennis Kowalski's story would become the cautionary tale that proved Maggie's philosophy. Dennis would work for 3 more dealerships over 20 years, would push aggressive financing at each one, would earn over $2 million in commissions and spend every dollar as fast as it arrived. New trucks, leased cars, an expanding lifestyle that consumed everything and saved nothing. When the 2008 recession closed his employer's doors, Dennis would have $45,000 to his name, would work retail at a farm supply store for 6 years, would retire with Social Security and $92,000 in savings. Ray would retire with $960,000. Same industry, same era, same opportunities, different philosophies, different outcomes. The changes at the dealership came in stages the way all real changes come. Not in a single dramatic gesture, but in a series of small decisions that accumulated over months and years into something that looked from the outside like a transformation. But from the inside, it felt more like a correction, like turning a wheel that had been pulling to the left for 23 years and finally pointing it straight. The first change was the questions. Ray stopped asking customers, "What can I sell you?" and started asking, "What do you actually need?" The difference between those two questions is the difference between a salesman and an advisor, and the difference in outcomes is the difference between a customer who drives away with a monthly payment and a customer who drives away with a solution. The second change was harder. Ray stopped pushing new equipment to farmers who could not afford it. This required him to look at his customers and see their situations rather than their potential commissions. To look at a young farmer's balance sheet and say, honestly, you should not be buying new right now. You should be buying used. Here is where to find good used equipment. Here is what to look for. Here is how to avoid the junk. Here is the name of a mechanic who will check it over before you commit. And here is my phone number if you have questions. Every one of those conversations cost Ray money. Every one of them reduced his commission. Every one of them meant a smaller paycheck at the end of the month and a harder conversation with Carol about the budget. But every one of them also meant a farmer who was not carrying debt he could not afford. A family that was not lying awake at night wondering if the next drought or the next price drop would be the one that took them under. The third change was teaching. Ray started hosting free clinics on Saturday mornings in the shop. Basic tractor maintenance, how to change oil, how to replace hydraulic hoses and filters, how to adjust brakes, how to troubleshoot an engine that would not start on a cold morning, how to do the simple repairs that the dealer's service department charged $45 an hour for, and that any farmer with basic tools and basic knowledge could do in his own barn. The clinics cost Ray service revenue. Every farmer who learned to change his own oil was a farmer who was not paying the dealership to change it, but every farmer who changed his own oil was also a farmer who understood his equipment better, who caught problems before they became catastrophes, who felt the particular satisfaction and confidence that comes from fixing something with your own hands instead of writing a check. Mike Ellsworth, the young salesman Ray had hired to replace Dennis, embraced the new approach with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting his whole life for someone to give him permission to do business the right way. Mike had watched his father struggle, had watched the debt accumulate, had watched the hope drain out of his father's eyes as the payments came due and the prices fell and the math stopped working. Mike understood in his bones what Ray was learning from his head, that selling someone something they cannot afford is not selling. It is setting a trap. And the trap does not care how politely it was set or how sincerely the salesman smiled when he slid the paperwork across the desk. Together, Ray and Mike rebuilt the dealership's culture from the foundation up. They trained the service department to be honest about repair costs, to tell a farmer when a repair was not worth the money, to recommend alternatives, to treat every dollar of the customer's money as if it were their own. They restructured the parts department to stock more maintenance items and fewer luxury accessories. They converted a corner of the showroom into a reference library with repair manuals and maintenance guides that customers could borrow for free. The results were slow in coming and overwhelming when they arrived. In the first year, 1988, sales dropped 15%. Revenue fell. Ray's income dropped $12,000. The regional manager from Deere & Company called to express concern. Was there a problem? Market conditions, competition, staff issues? No problems, Ray said, just a different approach. The regional manager was skeptical. Sales volume was the metric. Sales volume was the language. Sales volume was the religion, and Ray had just announced his apostasy. But something else was happening, something that did not show up on the sales reports or the quarterly summaries. Something that traveled through the farming community at the speed of conversation through the feed mill and the diner and the co-op and the gas station and the church parking lot on Sunday morning. Trust. Farmers were talking about Ray Prescott the way they talked about a good veterinarian or an honest mechanic, or a neighbor who always showed up to help with harvest without being asked. Ray Prescott will tell you the truth. Ray Prescott will not sell you something you do not need. Ray Prescott actually cares whether you make it or not. That kind of reputation cannot be purchased, cannot be manufactured, cannot be simulated by a clever marketing campaign or a spring sale event banner or a brass plaque on an office wall. It can only be earned one honest conversation at a time, one customer at a time, one moment of choosing integrity over commission at a time. By 1989, farmers from Boone County were driving past two other John Deere dealers to buy from Ray. By 1990, farmers from Hamilton County were making the trip. By 91, Ray had customers in 6 counties, a radius that had been 3 counties under the old philosophy. By 1992, his sales volume had rebounded to 48 new tractors, 6 more than his best year under Dennis Kowalski's aggressive approach. But the quality of those sales was different. These were farmers who had saved for the purchase, who could write a check or finance over 3 years instead of 7, who would still be farming 5 years later because they were not leveraged to breaking. Default rates on Ray's finance sales dropped to near zero. Not near zero in the sense that dealers use when they mean 3 or 4%. Actually near zero, 1 default in 4 years. 1. The regional manager stopped calling with concerns and started calling with questions. What are you doing? How are we replicating this? Can you come speak at the regional meeting? Ray went to the regional meeting, stood in front of 32 John Deere dealers from across central Iowa, and told them the story of Maggie Caldwell and the old Farmall. Told them about the grocery bag full of cash, about the barn full of restored tractors, about the $1 million net worth hidden behind worn overalls and a rusty truck, about the philosophy that small and paid for beats large and leveraged every time. The room was quiet when he finished. A few dealers nodded, a few looked uncomfortable. Most looked skeptical, the way people look when they hear something that contradicts everything they believe, but cannot immediately identify the flaw in the argument. One dealer raised his hand. That is a nice story, but we are in the business of selling new tractors. How does telling farmers to buy used help us sell new? It does not, Ray said. Not immediately, not directly, but it builds trust. And trust brings customers to your door for the rest of their farming lives. The farmer I talked into buying used in '88 came back in '92 and bought new, because by then he could afford it. And he brought his brother, and his neighbor, and his brother's neighbor. One honest conversation in '88 turned into 7 tractor sales by '95, all to farmers who could afford what they bought, and all without a single default. Some dealers understood, most did not. That was fine with Ray. He had stopped needing other people's approval the day he met Maggie Caldwell. And that freedom, the freedom from caring what other people thought of his business philosophy, was itself one of Maggie's lessons. The invisible wealth of not needing applause. The first months were hard. Sales dropped. Ray sold 3 new tractors in April instead of 6. Income fell from $7,000 to $4,500 a month. He hired a young man named Mike Ellsworth to replace Dennis. Mike had grown up on a farm outside Gilbert, had watched his father struggle with equipment debt through the '80s, had heard his parents argue about money through thin farmhouse walls. Mike understood immediately what Ray was building. Ray and Carol sat at their kitchen table one September evening with a legal pad between them and did something they had never done in 20 years of marriage. Added up every dollar they spent, line by line. The numbers were sobering. The 4-bedroom on Ridgewood cost $1,800 a month between mortgage, taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Country Club $4,000 a year. 2 car payments, $700 a month. Dining out $300. Vacations $8,000 to $10,000 a year. Clothes, gifts, subscriptions. The accumulated small expenses that individually seemed trivial and collectively consumed a fortune. Total annual spending, $75,000 on $80,000 income. Carol looked at the number. We have been doing this for 20 years. That is $1.5 million. How much do we still have? Maybe $200,000, including the house. $1.3 million spent, $200,000 kept. Maggie made less than half what you make, and she is worth 6 times what we are. They listed everything they could change, not in deprivation, but in clarity. In 1990, they sold the house on Ridgewood for $178,000, bought a smaller 3-bedroom on Elm Street for $98,000, banked the difference. Ray kept the Buick until it hit 200,000 miles in '96, replaced it with a 3-year-old Chevy for $12,000 instead of a new one for $28,000. Carol quit the country club, started a real garden in the backyard, grew tomatoes and peppers and herbs, saved $400 a year on produce and discovered she loved the work, loved the dirt under her nails, loved being a little bit more like Maggie Caldwell. They took camping trips instead of resort vacations, drove to Minnesota Lake Country instead of flying to Florida. The trips were not worse. They were different, and different they discovered could be better. Between 1988 and 2003, the Prescotts saved $740,000 additional dollars. Maggie Caldwell's fingerprints were on everyone. Meanwhile, the dealership transformed. By 1990, word had spread across central Iowa. Prescott's John Deere gives honest advice. Will not sell you something you cannot afford. Farmers drove past 3 other dealers to buy from Ray because they trusted him. Trust was slow to build and impossible to fake, but it was building. By 92, sales rebounded to 48 tractors, 6 more than the old peak. But these were different sales to farmers who could afford what they bought. Default rates dropped to near zero. The regional manager called to ask what Ray was doing differently. I stopped selling tractors, Ray said. Started selling advice. The tractors follow. And at the center of it all, invisible as always, was Maggie. Still farming her 280, still driving the rusty Ford, still restoring tractors in her barn on winter evenings talking to Hank as she worked, still wearing the same overalls, still living on $12,000 a year. They spoke occasionally. Ray would stop by for coffee. Maggie would share some observation about farming or money or life. Never preachy, never lecturing. Just a woman describing her experience to a man who was finally willing to listen. Once in the winter of '90, Ray asked what Hank would think of everything she had built. Maggie was in the barn working on a '47 Farmall M. The kerosene heater glowed in the corner. She was cleaning a carburetor with a toothbrush and solvent hands moving with surgical precision. She was quiet for a long time. He would say I should have bought those 40 acres the Petersons were selling in '78. He always wanted more land. I always wanted more freedom. We argued about it once in '68. After that, he let me handle the money. She smiled. Best decision he ever made, and he knew it. Maggie Caldwell farmed until 2005. She was 79 years old. Her hands still worked, though the arthritis had been advancing for years, slowly curling her fingers into shapes that resisted the wrench and the paintbrush with increasing stubbornness. Her mind still worked sharp as it had ever been, still calculating costs and clearances and torque specifications from memory, the way other people remember phone numbers. Her body, which had carried her through 48 years of farming and 63 tractor restorations, and the loss of the only man she had ever loved, had begun to negotiate its terms. The first sign was the hip, a dull ache that became a sharp ache that became a limp she could not hide no matter how carefully she placed her steps. She ignored it for 6 months the way she ignored most inconveniences, with silence and determination, and the stubborn refusal to let physical complaint interfere with physical work. But by March of 2005, she could not climb onto the tractor seat without using both hands and a mounting step she had welded from scrap steel and bolted to the drawbar. The step was practical and efficient. That it was necessary was the concession she made to her body. That it was visible was the concession she could not avoid. Ray noticed during one of his visits. Maggie was crossing the yard from the barn to the house, and her gait had changed. The woman who had always moved with brisk, purposeful efficiency was walking carefully now, favoring her left side, placing each boot with the deliberation of someone measuring the distance between where they are and where they need to be. Your hip is bothering you. It is fine. It is not fine. You are limping. I have been limping since February. It is manageable. But Ray saw something he had not seen before in Maggie Caldwell's eyes. Not pain. She could handle pain. What he saw was calculation. The cold arithmetic of a woman measuring how much time her body would give her and deciding how to spend what remained. She sold the farm that summer. $675,000. The buyers were a young farming couple from Marshalltown who had been looking for land in Story County. Good people, hard workers. Reminded Maggie of herself and Hank in the early years. She sold below market value. Could have gotten $750. But she liked them and trusted them and wanted the land to be farmed by people who would care for it the way she and Hank had cared for it. She kept the farmhouse, the barn, 3 acres around the buildings. Enough space for a garden and the machine shed and the quiet life she had earned. The collection, 15 perfectly restored vintage international harvesters, the accumulated work of nearly 50 years, every one of them a resurrection. She auctioned the collection in September of 2005. The sale drew collectors from 12 states. The auction house set up a tent in Maggie's yard, folding chairs on the grass, a portable PA system, coffee and donuts by the barn. The morning was clear and cool, the kind of September morning that makes Iowa look like a painting. Ray sat in the third row, 65 years old, retired 2 years, 960,000 in savings and investments, all of it traceable to that Tuesday in April, 18 years earlier. The tractors sold one by one. The Farmall H for 23,000, the 450 for 26, the 60 model 560 for 28, each one a masterpiece, each one carrying years of Maggie's labor and Hank's memory. Then the final lot, the 1962 Farmall 560, the tractor Ray had sold her for $6,000. 17 years since the restoration, still flawless. Bidding opened at 15,000, rose quickly, 20, 25, 28. Two collectors from Minnesota went back and forth, 30, 31, 32. The hammer fell at $32,000. The buyer was Gerald Osterman, a retired engineer from Rochester, Minnesota, who had followed Maggie's work for 15 years. He shook her hand. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is the finest Farmall 560 I have ever seen. You are an artist." "Take care of it," Maggie said. The entire collection brought $412,000. The money went into a scholarship fund for agricultural students at Iowa State. The years after were quiet. Maggie lived in the farmhouse, tended her garden, read her tractor manuals, watched the young couple farming her land, and felt the peace of someone who has completed the important work and can rest. Ray visited every few weeks. They sat on the porch and talked about farming and weather and Hank. Maggie told stories Ray had never heard. How Hank could rebuild a carburetor by feeling the dark. How he sang hymns off-key while plowing. How he once drove their old Farmall 6 miles to bring her flowers on their anniversary because the truck had a flat and he did not want to be late. Sometimes they said nothing. Just sat in the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other well enough to skip the words. Ray once asked if she was lonely. Alone is not the same as lonely. I have the farm, my memories, the work I did. Hank is still here, in the soil, in the barn, in every tractor I restored. That is not loneliness. That is the opposite. She never complained about the hip or the arthritis curling her hands. Never spoke about aging except once. Autumn of 2010, the fields golden with unharvested corn, geese moving south in ragged V formations. Maggie was 84. "I have had a good life. Hank would have been proud. I just wish I could do one more. There is a 44 Farmall A at a sale in Grundy County. Needs everything. I can see what it should look like. Clear as a photograph. But my hands will not do what my mind tells them anymore." She said it without self-pity. A mechanical fact. The part has reached the end of its service life. Ray said nothing, sat with her in the October wind, and let the silence hold what words could not. Margaret Rose Caldwell died on March 14, 2012. She was 86 years old, died in her farmhouse in the bedroom she had shared with Hank for 26 years, and slept alone in for 33 more. Peacefully, in her sleep, no hospital, no machines, just the old house and the wind and the silence of a completed life. The obituary in the Nevada Journal was 4 paragraphs. Said nothing about the tractors or the money or the lives she had changed. Maggie would have approved. The funeral was at First Presbyterian Church in Nevada. The church held 250. 300 came. They lined the walls, filled the vestibule, stood outside in the March cold. Ray sat in the second row, 72, white-haired, Carol beside him crying from the first hymn. A single photograph at the front, Maggie standing next to the 62 Farmall 560 the day she finished the restoration. Overalls, cap, working hands on her hips, smiling the smile of a woman who had turned $6,000 of junk into something permanent and beautiful. Reverend Thomas Whitfield spoke. "Margaret Caldwell was the richest poor woman I ever knew. She had millions but lived like she had thousands. She could have bought anything but wanted nothing. She helped everyone but told no one." He paused. "I learned this morning that some of you have stories about Maggie that the rest of us have never heard. She left a letter. Her words, let them tell it if they want to. I could never figure out how to say it myself without sounding like I was bragging. And I was never any good at bragging." A man stood in the fourth row, 39, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, wearing a suit that did not fit perfectly. Nate Hargrove. I was 24 in 93. My dad lost our farm in 86. Bank took everything. 3 generations gone because corn went to $2 and interest hit 18%. I grew up in a rental house in Colorado. Watched my father drink himself to sleep because he could not look at a field without seeing what he had lost. 300 people holding their breath. I saved 6,000 working construction, wanted to farm, had nothing, no land, no equipment, no credit. Every bank said no. The son of a man who lost his farm is not a customer banks want. He looked at the photograph. I mentioned it to Maggie at the feed mill. She said, come by tomorrow. She showed me a restored 56 Farmall 450, said this is worth 20,000. I will sell it to you for 12. Pay me back whenever. No interest, no deadline. His voice broke. I asked why. She said because everybody needs a start and banks do not help young farmers anymore. I do. I farmed with that farm all 8 years. Paid her back over 6. She never asked, never reminded me. Today I own 400 acres, net worth over 400,000. I tried to pay interest. She refused, said just help another young farmer someday. That is the interest I want. Nate Hargrove paused. The church was holding its breath. 300 people in wooden pews and along plaster walls and in the vestibule where the cold March air leaked under the door, all of them suspended in the particular silence that descends when a truth too large for the room is being spoken aloud. He continued, that first year I had nothing but the Farmall and 40 rented acres and the $6,000 I had saved from construction work. No planter, no combine, no truck worth the name. I custom hired the planting and the harvesting and kept the Farmall for field work, tillage, and cultivation, and the 100 jobs a tractor does between planting and harvest that nobody thinks about but every farmer depends on. The Farmall ran like a watch. Maggie's restoration was not cosmetic. It was mechanical perfection. That engine started every morning on the first crank. The hydraulics lifted whatever I asked them to lift. The transmission shifted clean and smooth. I farmed with that tractor for 8 years, and in 8 years I replaced the oil in the filters and nothing else. Not a gasket, not a seal, not a bearing. Maggie had built the machine to last, and it lasted. By the 3rd year, I was able to buy my own planter. Used, of course. Maggie taught me that. Buy quality used, she said. Pay cash. If you cannot pay cash, you cannot afford it. Wait until you can. The waiting is the price of freedom, and freedom is worth the wait. By the 5th year, I owned my first 40 acres. $80,000 paid in cash, every dollar earned from those rented fields and saved from a life lived the way Maggie lived hers. Below my means, below the standard everyone else considered normal. I drove a truck that was worse than Maggie's. Ate beans and rice 4 nights a week. Wore boots until they leaked, and then wore them longer because leaking boots still keep out most of the mud, and new boots cost money that could be earning interest in a savings account. By the 8th year, I paid Maggie back the full $12,000. She never asked for it. Not once in 8 years did she mention the money. Not once did she check on the balance or inquire about my finances or suggest however gently that a payment might be due. She trusted me, completely, the way you trust the sun to rise. And that trust, the weight of it, the honor of it, was more motivating than any bank's collection department could ever be. I would have starved before I let Maggie Caldwell down. He looked around the church. When I brought her the last payment, $1,200 in a white envelope, she was in the barn working on a Farmall M. She took the envelope, counted the money, nodded, and said, you did good. Now help another young farmer someday. That is the only interest I will ever charge. I asked her how I would know when I found the right person to help. She smiled. That smile she had, the one that meant she knew something you had not figured out yet. You will know, she said, because they will remind you of yourself. And you will remember what it felt like to have no one believe in you except an old woman in overalls. He sat down. The silence lasted 5 full seconds before it was broken by a sound that Ray would remember for the rest of his life. The sound of 300 people crying at the same time. Not loudly, not dramatically. The quiet, uncontrollable weeping that comes when the heart encounters something it recognizes as true and responds with the only language it knows. Laura Fielding stood next. She was composed in the way that teachers are composed, with the practiced control of someone who has learned to hold herself together in front of an audience. but her hands shook where she gripped the pew in front of her. "I want to tell you something about Maggie that the men in this room might not understand," she said. "When a woman decides to farm, she does not just have to learn farming. She has to learn how to be dismissed, how to be patronized, how to walk into a bank or a dealership or a co-op meeting and be treated like a curiosity at best and a nuisance at worst. She has to learn how to hear the word no said in 100 different ways, some polite and some not, and keep going anyway. She has to develop a skin thick enough to withstand the doubts of everyone around her and thin enough to still feel the soil between her fingers and the rain on her face, and the satisfaction of watching something she planted push through the earth toward the sun." Maggie understood that, not because, as I told her, I never had to tell her. She had lived it for 26 years farming beside Hank, and then for 26 more years farming alone. She knew what it cost a woman to stand in a man's world and refuse to leave. When she loaned me the $22,000, she did not just give me money, she gave me permission. Permission to believe that what I wanted was possible, that the dream was not foolish, that a woman could farm and succeed and build something lasting not despite being a woman, but because of the particular qualities that women bring to the work. Patience, attention to detail, the ability to plan 3 seasons ahead, the willingness to sacrifice present comfort for future security. Maggie had all of those qualities, and she recognized them in me before I recognized them in myself. That is what made her gift so powerful. It was not the money, it was the seeing. She saw me, saw what I could become. And that seeing that recognition from someone who had done what I wanted to do was worth more than the $22,000, though the $22,000 was pretty useful too. A few people laughed through their tears. Laura smiled briefly, then continued. "I paid her back in 4 years, drove to her farm on a Saturday morning with an envelope containing the last payment. She was on her porch drinking coffee. She took the envelope, looked inside, and said, 'Took you long enough.' I expected 3 years. I think she was joking. I was never entirely sure with Maggie. Then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, 'You did not need my money. You needed someone to say yes when everyone else said no. Remember that when it is your turn to say yes to someone.'" Laura sat down. The crying in the church had not stopped. It had changed in quality. It was no longer grief. It was something closer to awe. Marcus Dalton stood last of the 3 who spoke at length, though 3 more would follow with shorter testimonies. Marcus was tall and held himself with the careful posture of a man who had spent his life being evaluated by people who saw his face before they heard his words. "I want to be clear about something," Marcus said. "When I say my parents were migrant workers, I do not say it for sympathy. I say it so you understand the distance between where I started and where I am. That distance is not about miles or money. It is about belief. It is about the difference between a world that looks at you and sees a worker and a world that looks at you and sees a farmer. My father worked the harvest from Texas to Minnesota for 30 years. My mother worked beside him. They moved every few months, followed the crops the way geese follow the seasons. They never owned anything larger than a suitcase. They never had a bank account larger than 2 months' expenses. They never had the luxury of imagining that their son might own the land they worked on. I was the first person in my family to graduate high school, the first to graduate college, the first to sit in a classroom where the other students did not look like me and did not come from where I came from and did not understand why I studied so hard. I studied hard because studying was the only tool I had, the only ladder out of a life that was not bad but was limited. My parents did not give me land or money or connections. They gave me something better. They gave me the understanding that hard work is the foundation of everything and that anything built on a different foundation will eventually fall. But hard work alone was not enough. I graduated with a degree in agronomy and $42,000 in debt. I knew how to grow things. I knew soil chemistry and plant genetics and crop rotation and integrated pest management. What I did not know was how to get from where I was to where I wanted to be when $42,000 of debt stood between me and the starting line. Maggie Caldwell saw past the debt, past the background, past the name and the face and the story that most people heard and categorized and dismissed. She saw a farmer, the way she saw a tractor inside a pile of rust, the way she saw value inside things the world considered worthless. She paid off my student loans, $42,000, wrote a check from her kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the same chair where she drank her morning coffee wearing the same overalls she wore every day, and changed the trajectory of my entire life as casually as if she were paying a feed bill. I have thought about that moment every day for the past 15 years. Not the money, the gesture, the effortlessness of it, the way she treated an act of extraordinary generosity as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Because for Maggie, it was. She had spent her life finding broken things and making them whole. A tractor, a farm, a young man with a dream and no way to reach it. To her, it was all the same work. See the value, invest the time, trust the process, and do not expect applause because applause is for performers and Maggie Caldwell was not performing anything. She was simply living. A woman stood, 48, hair pulled back, dark borrowed dress, Laura Fielding. I was 31 and 95. First generation farmer, no family land, 28,000 saved from 10 years of teaching, found 40 acres for sale, 78,000, needed 50 down, had 28, banks would not lend the gap. Too small, too risky. What they meant was you are a single woman with no experience. A friend told me about Maggie. I drove to her farm terrified. She asked one question. You serious about farming? I said it is all I have ever wanted. She said I will loan you 22,000. Pay when you can. No interest. Laura's voice wavered. A woman helped a woman when no one else would. I paid her back in 4 years. Today I own 240 acres worth 960,000. And it started with 22,000 from a woman I had met once who looked at me and saw something the banks refused to see. A third person stood, early 40s, tall, Marcus Dalton. My parents were migrant workers. I grew up in poverty, 3 jobs through school, graduated Iowa State in agronomy with 42,000 in student debt. Wanted to farm. The debt trapped me. Could not save while paying $950 a month. Met Maggie at an auction. We talked. Week later she called, said I will pay off your student loans. 42,000. Pay me back when you can. No interest. 300 people inhaled. I said I could not accept it. She said you can and you will. I have more money than I will ever spend. It should help people who will use it well. Maggie paid off my loans. I saved 45,000 in 4 years. Bought a farm, paid her back over 6 more. Today I own 380 acres worth 1.6 million. Net worth 1.1 million. Because a woman in overalls believed in me when nobody else did. 3 more farmers stood. 3 more stories. Same pattern, a dream and no resources. A quiet loan, lives transformed. Total loaned $184,000. All paid back. None with interest. 6 farmers, 6 successes. Not one person in the church had known. The Reverend returned, eyes red. Margaret Caldwell gave away nearly $200,000. Never asked for terms. Never charged interest, never told a soul. She helped because she could. That is a life well lived. Maggie's estate was 2.1 million, built over 50 years from 280 acres and 63 tractors, never borrowed after 79. Half 1,050,000 established the Margaret Caldwell Beginning Farmer Fund. Interest-free loans for young farmers. Borrow what you need, pay when you can, help another farmer someday. The other half went to her church and agricultural education programs across central Iowa. Since 2013, the fund has helped 28 young farmers, 26 still farming, 93% success rate. In 2018, 6 years after Maggie's death, a farm equipment auction was held in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. The estate of Gerald Osterman, who had bought Maggie's Farmall 560 in 2005. Gerald had died the previous year. The tractor appeared in the catalog. 1962 Farmall 560. Complete restoration by Margaret Caldwell. Starting bid 20,000. Bidding lasted 11 minutes. Collectors from 7 states. 25, 30, 35, 40, 45. The hammer fell at $48,000. A tractor Ray sold for $6,000. Restored by a woman everyone underestimated. Sold for 32. Sold again for 48. 31 years later. 8 times the original price. Maggie had seen it from the beginning. Standing at the parts counter in her overalls, she had seen what that tractor was worth. Not its present value, its potential value. The value that skill and patience and 400 hours of solitary labor could create from something the world had dismissed. In 2017, Ray was invited to speak at the Iowa Farm Bureau annual meeting. 82, white-haired, cane in his left hand, still sharp. 800 farmers in a convention hall in Des Moines. Ray told the story of Maggie Caldwell and the old Farmall, exactly as it happened. No exaggeration, no embellishment. He told them about the grocery bag, the barn full of tractors, the $1 million net worth hidden behind worn overalls, the 6 young farmers, and the loans nobody knew about. He ended with this: you do not need to be big to be successful. You do not need new equipment to be profitable. You do not need to impress anyone to build wealth. You just need discipline, patience, and the courage to ignore what everyone else is doing. Maggie farmed 280 acres her entire life, never expanded, drove a rusty truck until the day she stopped driving. Everyone thought she was poor. She died with nearly $3 million and changed hundreds of lives. That is success, real success, the kind you cannot see from the road. Ray paused at the podium. The convention hall in Des Moines was quiet in a way that large rooms rarely achieve. 800 farmers in rows of folding chairs, men and women who spent their lives in the loudest environments, diesel engines and grain dryers and combined headers in the relentless wind across open fields, all of them sitting in a silence so complete you could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. He looked at his notes. One sheet of paper. He had written the speech in an hour sitting at the kitchen table in the house on Elm Street, the same table where he and Carol had done the math 17 years earlier, and discovered that they were rich in appearances and poor in substance. He did not need extensive notes. The story of Maggie Caldwell was not something he had to remember. It was something he could not forget. I sold 42 new tractors my last year under the old system, he said. Gross commissions of about $92,000. I felt successful. I looked successful. I drove a nice car and lived in a nice house and belonged to the country club and wore pressed clothes every day. I was the picture of a thriving small-town businessman. Maggie Caldwell made $47,000 that year, total, from everything. She drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it. She lived in a house that was probably worth $70,000. She wore overalls that cost $30 and boots that she resold herself. She had never belonged to a club of any kind in her life, and she was worth 6.5 times what I was worth. Not because she earned more, because she kept more, because she understood something I did not understand until I was 47 years old, and she was kind enough to show me. He looked up from his notes. The lesson is not about tractors. It is not about farming. It is not about money. Though the money is the easiest part to measure and therefore the part that gets the most attention. The lesson is about freedom, about what it means to own your life instead of renting it from a bank, about what it means to need nothing from anyone and therefore owe nothing to anyone and therefore be free to do what you love and help who you choose and sleep well every night of your life. Maggie was free. She was the freest person I ever met, free from debt, free from pretense, free from the need for anyone's approval or recognition or admiration, free from the exhausting, expensive, ultimately pointless performance of success that most of us spend our lives rehearsing and staging and funding. She was free because she kept it simple. She was free because she stayed small. She was free because she said no to everything the world tried to sell her and yes to everything that actually mattered. Work she loved, skills she mastered, money she saved, people she helped. He gripped the podium. I am not telling you to stop buying new equipment. I am not telling you to stop expanding. I am not telling you to do anything except this before you sign the next loan, before you agree to the next payment. Schedule before you leverage the next acre of land against the next piece of machinery. Ask yourself one question. What would Maggie do? The silence held for 2 beats after he stopped speaking. Then the applause began. It started in the back of the room, a single pair of hands, and spread forward like a wave growing in volume and intensity until all 800 people were on their feet, and the sound filled the convention hall, the way water fills a basin completely and without reservation. Ray stood at the podium and let the applause wash over him and thought about Maggie Caldwell, who would have hated every second of this attention and would have told him so in her quiet, direct, matter-of-fact way, and who was probably even now standing in a barn somewhere beyond this world talking to Hank about ring gaps and paint formulas and whether the carburetor on the 47 Farmall M was going to give her trouble. The speech was recorded on someone's camcorder and eventually posted online where it accumulated 280,000 views over the next several years. Comments came from across the country and eventually from around the world. Farmers in Nebraska and Kansas and Indiana and Montana who said, "This is my grandfather's story." City people in New York and San Francisco who said, "I needed to hear this today." Young people in their 20s who said, "We need more people like Maggie in the world." Old people in their 80s who said, "She sounds exactly like my mother." Two comments stayed with Ray. The first: "I am a bank loan officer in rural Minnesota. I have been pushing farm loans for 20 years. This video made me question everything about how I do my job. I went to work the next morning and looked at the applications on my desk differently. 3 of them were farmers borrowing money they could not afford to repay. I denied all 3. My supervisor was furious. I told him to watch the video. He did. He denied the next 2 himself. The second: my name is not important. I farm 240 acres in southern Ohio. I have been in debt since I was 22 years old. I am 57 now. I owe $400,000. I have been making payments for 35 years, and the balance never seems to go down because the interest eats everything I pay and then asks for more. I watched this video at 2 in the morning because I could not sleep because I am worried about making the next payment. After I watched it, I sat at my kitchen table and cried for 20 minutes. Not because of sadness, because of regret. Because I have spent 35 years doing the opposite of what Maggie did, and because it is too late for me to start over. But it is not too late for my son. He wants to farm. He is 23. I am going to show him this video and tell him, start small, stay small, pay cash, be free, be Maggie. Ray read that comment 3 times. Then he closed his laptop and sat in his kitchen and looked at the photograph on the wall. April 1987. 2 people in a tractor. One of them laughing because he thought he knew everything. The other smiling because she actually did. Standing ovation, 3 minutes. Farmers wiping tears. Not because it was sad, because it was true. A young woman waited at the bottom of the steps. 26. Beginning farmer from Pocahontas County. "Mr. Prescott, I applied for the Caldwell Fund. They approved me. $28,000, interest-free. I am buying my first 40 acres next week." Her eyes were bright and certain, the way Maggie's had been in '87. "You remind me of someone," Ray said. Ray Prescott died in 2019, 79. At his funeral, his daughter placed a photograph beside the casket. April '87, Ray and Maggie in front of the Farmall 560, both squinting in the Iowa sun. Ray holding the title, Maggie holding the keys. His daughter gave the eulogy. "My father said the day he sold Maggie that tractor was the day he stopped being a salesman and started being a teacher. That lesson made him a better man. Dad kept a journal from '87 on. Tracked every farmer he helped by recommending used instead of new. 418 farmers over 23 years. 391 still farming as of 2010. 27 failed. 93% success rate. Industry average for farmers on aggressive financing during the same period. 58%, 42% failed. Dad's approach saved hundreds of families, kept them on their land, prevented bankruptcies. All because a woman in overalls walked into a dealership with a grocery bag full of cash. And my father was smart enough eventually to stop laughing and start listening. The story does not end, it echoes. Nate Hargrove sold a used tractor to a struggling 24-year-old in 2007. Same terms, no interest, pay when you can. That farmer now works 600 acres and has already helped someone else. In 2007, Nate Hargrove kept the promise he had made to Maggie. A 24-year-old farmer named Tyler Skaggs came to Nate's place looking for work. Tyler had grown up in town, no farming background, but he had spent 2 summers working on a neighbor's farm and had caught the sickness, the particular affliction that strikes certain people when they put their hands in soil and feel something ancient and irresistible stir inside them. Tyler had $3,000 saved and no idea how to turn $3,000 into a farm. Nate saw himself in Tyler's face, saw the hunger, the uncertainty, the particular combination of ambition and terror that marks a young person standing at the beginning of something enormous with almost nothing to stand on. He sold Tyler a used tractor for $8,000. No interest. Pay when you can. Tyler paid it back in 4 years. By 2015, he was farming 600 acres. By 2020, he had helped another young farmer get started with a used equipment loan. No interest. Pay when you can. The chain continued. Laura Fielding's mentorship program for women in agriculture grew into something that neither she nor Maggie could have predicted. Laura started with one workshop in 2008, 6 women around a kitchen table in her farmhouse, drinking coffee and talking about soil tests and crop insurance and the particular challenges of being female in a male-dominated industry. By 2012, she was running quarterly workshops with 20 participants each. By 2018, she had formalized the program into a year-long mentorship with structured curriculum field visits, financial planning workshops, and a network of experienced women farmers who served as advisors and role models. 32 women completed the program. 12 started their own farming operations. 3 of those 12 became mentors themselves, running satellite programs in other counties. The tree that Maggie had planted with a $22,000 loan was branching in directions no one could have mapped. Laura never charged for the program, funded it from her farming income and from donations, and from the particular Iowa tradition of neighbors helping neighbors that has sustained rural communities since the prairie was first broken. When people asked her why she did it for free, she told them about Maggie. "Someone gave me a chance when no one else would," she said. "I am just passing it on. That is how it works. You receive, you grow, you give. The chain does not end, it just gets longer." Marcus Dalton's scholarship at Iowa State, the Caldwell-Dalton Agricultural Promise, became one of the most competitive awards in the College of Agriculture. Not because of the money, though the money was meaningful, $5,000 per year for 4 years, because of what it represented. Because the application asked one question that no other scholarship asked: describe a time when someone believed in you before you believed in yourself, and explain what you would do with that same power if it were given to you. The question was Marcus's idea. He had written it in one draft without revision because it was the question his own life had answered, and the answer was Maggie Caldwell, standing in her kitchen, writing a check for $42,000 with the same casual certainty with which she would have written a check for 42 cents. 14 students received the scholarship between 2012 and 2025. All 14 graduated. 11 entered farming or agricultural careers. 3 bought their own land. Each of them knew Maggie's story because Marcus told it at every scholarship dinner, every award ceremony, every gathering where the Caldwell-Dalton name was spoken. He told it the same way every time, simply, without embellishment. The facts were dramatic enough. "A woman I met once at an auction changed my life with a check and a sentence. The check was for $42,000. The sentence was, you can and you will." The Margaret Caldwell Beginning Farmer Fund, managed by a board of trustees that included Ray Prescott until his death, and Laura Fielding and Marcus Dalton, and 2 agricultural economists from Iowa State, rated with a simplicity that Maggie would have approved. No complex applications, no credit checks, no collateral requirements, no bureaucracy, a one-page form, a personal interview, a handshake. The terms were Maggie's terms, unchanged from the ones she had offered in her kitchen and her barn over the years. Borrow what you need, pay it back when you can. No interest. Help another farmer someday. 28 young farmers received loans from the fund between 2013 and 2025. The total disbursed was $642,000. 26 of the 28 were still farming. The 2 who had left farming had repaid their loans in full before changing careers. Total losses 0. Total interest charged 0. Total lives changed incalculable. The fund's 93% success rate was not a statistical anomaly. It was the predictable result of a lending philosophy that Maggie had practiced for decades and that conventional banking had never understood. The philosophy was simple: trust people. Give them a chance. Believe that they will succeed, and they usually will. Not because trust is magical, because trust changes the borrower's relationship with the obligation. A bank loan is a burden. Maggie's loan was a gift. You repay a burden because you have to. You repay a gift because you want to. Because the person who gave it to you believed in you, and defaulting on that belief is a kind of moral failure that no amount of financial restructuring can repair. Every one of the 28 farmers who received a loan from the Caldwell Fund knew Maggie's story, knew about the overalls and the rusty truck and the barn full of tractors and the grocery bag full of cash, knew about the invisibility, knew about the freedom, knew about the woman who built $2.1 million from 280 acres and a hobby and a relentless commitment to living below her means. And every one of them in their own way carried a piece of Maggie forward, in the way they farmed, in the way they saved, in the way they helped their neighbors, in the quiet, unshowy, unphotographable act of living well on less than the world says you need and being happier for it. That is the legacy, not the money, and the mindset. The proof demonstrated over 5 decades and passed forward through generations that you can build wealth doing what you love and living simply and keeping it all quiet and giving it away when the time comes and trusting the people you give it to and being right about that trust almost every single time. Laura Fielding started a mentorship program for women entering agriculture. 32 women have completed it, 12 run their own farms. Marcus Dalton established a scholarship at Iowa State, the Caldwell Dalton Agricultural Promise. 14 students through the agronomy program, 3 farming their own land. The fund has helped 28 young farmers, 26 still farming, a success rate that would make any bank jealous achieved without charging a cent of interest. And somewhere in Wisconsin, a 1962 Farmall 560 sits in a climate-controlled barn. Harvester red paint still perfect, chrome still gleaming, factory chalk marks still visible on the engine block. A tractor that was once considered junk, that sat behind a John Deere dealership for 8 months in the rain, that a woman in overalls bought for $6,000 in cash from a grocery bag and turned into something the world now values at $48,000 and climbing. The woman wanted the old Farmall. The dealer laughed. Then the dealer learned and taught and changed hundreds of lives. And the tractor carried the lesson forward the way tractors carry weight, steadily, patiently, without complaint, for as long as the work needs doing. Maggie Caldwell, 280 acres, a rusty truck, worn overalls, $2.1 million, and the wisdom to know that none of it mattered except the freedom it bought and the lives it changed. Never judge by appearance, always look deeper. The richest people often look the poorest. The wisest people often seem the simplest. And sometimes an old tractor is exactly what someone needs to teach a lesson worth more than any new machine ever sold. Maggie understood that from the beginning. She understood it the day she walked into the dealership with her grocery bag. She understood it the day she paid off the mortgage and told the banker she would not be needing his services. She understood it the day she started her first restoration with Hank in 1957, when they were young and poor and happy, and did not yet know that the happiness was the point and the poverty was temporary, and the work they did together in that barn would outlast them both. Ray Prescott learned it in time, not immediately, not easily, but thoroughly, completely, permanently. The way you learn something that changes the shape of your entire life and everything in it. May we all be wise enough to see past the surface to the truth underneath, past the overalls to the millionaire, past the rusty truck to the freedom, past the old tractor to the masterpiece waiting inside it. The old Farmall was never junk. It was a teacher. And the lesson it taught is teaching still will teach for as long as people tell the story is worth more than any shiny new tractor that ever rolled off a factory floor and into a showroom where a man in a green polo shirt measured success by what he sold instead of what he saved. The farmer wanted the old Farmall. The dealer laughed but got shocked. And the world became a little better because of what happened next.